Bé, bona tarda a tothom. Moltíssimes gràcies per ser a CIDOB.
For being here at CIDOB. This wonderful reaction we have had from all of you. It's wonderful to be able to organize this event with ICIP in our headquarters after so many months of not being able to see each other face to face, and to be able to do it not only within the framework of a very interesting dialogue, but also with some international speakers after so many months of pandemic. So this is an event led by the people who are here, especially because of the publishing of an extremely interesting book, given the time we're going through, how to end what's going on in the world, how to end with armed conflicts, and on my own behalf, as the director of CIDOB, I'd like to welcome, first of all, Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell is a man with a long-standing experience in peace negotiations, and currently he chairs Intermediate, the NGO, and he was the main British negotiator in the Northern Ireland conflict. Thank you for being with us again. You were with us at War and Peace about the Colombian conflict, and it's a great pleasure to have you too. So, Christian, you have the floor. Thank you so much for having made this proposal to us. Wonderful, Paul. Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. It's always a pleasure to organize a joint event. I'm going to introduce this conversation in Catalan, and then we will continue in Spanish and English. You have a simultaneous interpretation service, and thank you ever so much for having come. It is a great pleasure to have an in-person event. We are being followed via streaming through the CIDOB YouTube channel and the ICIP's Facebook. And well, thank you all for attending this event in person and virtually. The excuse to meet is that we have translated Mr. Powell's book into Spanish. But in fact, what summons us here is that the topic the book deals with is the classical topic in any armed conflict, the experience that both speakers have an experience in that field. And normally everybody asks the same questions. Do we need to negotiate? Who do we negotiate with? How do we negotiate? And these are questions that both Sergio, throughout his career in Colombia, and now also internationally, and also Jonathan, both Sergio and Jonathan have wondered about this. And they have a lot of information to share with us, given their experience, their practical experience. So very briefly, you know both speakers, they are well known, but I think it's worthwhile remembering their experience because it's going to be very relevant for what they will tell us. Jonathan is the director and founder of Intermediate, an NGO headquartered in London that works for the mediation in conflict. He has dialogued with many so-called terrorists organizations in many places in Europe and Asia, and he has cooperated with a humanitarian dialogue center headquartered in Geneva. Between 1979 and 1996, Mr. Powell worked as a diplomat for the British service, and amongst other things, he actually was part of the negotiations to return Hong Kong to China. In 2007, he became the head of the cabinet of Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was in charge of the IRA's conversations, which ended up in the Good Friday Agreement in 1997. So in 2008, in the very midst of the war against terror, he suggested publicly that Western governments should start having conversations with the Taliban, with Hamas and Al-Qaeda, as had been done with more traditional organizations. And this is what the arguments, he has published them in different publications, amongst which we have the book we have here in between my hands. Sergio Caramillo, who is he's a luxury guest. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Sergio Jaramillo has been the High Commissioner for Peace during Juan Manuel Santos' government between 2012 and 2016. He coordinated the peace negotiations with the FARC, the Colombian Armed Forces. He was the advisor for national security of the Colombian government between 2010 and 2012. He led the negotiations, the secret negotiations, the previous phase, the so-called phase number 1, afterwards was called the formal negotiations, and he will tell us about the phases and the structure of peace negotiations. He also was Deputy Minister of Defense for International Affairs, where he was in charge of security, intelligence, and human rights policies. And he was the director and founder of Ideas for Peace, a Colombian think tank with the presence of civil society and the business industry, the business sector committed with democracy and human rights. And finally, more recently, between 2017 and 2018, he was the ambassador of Colombia at the EU and Belgium. And currently, he's a senior ambassador of the European Institute for Peace in Brussels. Now, it's a long introduction, I know, but, well, because they have a long CV and they deserve that. So what we will do now is to structure the conversation into 3 initial blocks in which I will ask them a question to both of them, and they will have 5 minutes each to answer, and then we will start a dialogue. And then we will open up the Q&A, both for the in-person audience and for the online audience.
Of the conversations, which is actually the main purpose, which is to listen to both of you. The first block is on the global context. Talking to terrorists has always been a very sensitive issue. Both of you have done so in different contexts, having to navigate the political, the normative, and even, I would say, the moral dilemmas that accompany such a decision. When and how do you think it is necessary to initiate such a dialogue? And I would also like to ask, under what circumstances is it not advisable to do so? And if you want to start, Jonathan.
Let me thank you both very much indeed for inviting me to Barcelona. It's some of the places I go in the world, like Pyongyang, it requires quite a lot of invitations to go there. This one, it takes just one invitation because Barcelona is such a wonderful city to come to, so thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be with Sergio, who I've spent more than a decade now working with, and he and Anna Maria are close friends, and it's really a great pleasure to be here with them. And this is a subject that's very close to my heart and something I've devoted my life to since leaving government. And it is very difficult for democratic governments to be seen to be talking to terrorists. If you have people who are killing your people, your innocent people, to actually explain why it is that you are doing so is not an easy task at all. And that's why governments, over the centuries, have tried to avoid doing so. They try everything else first before they actually resort to that end. If we go back in our history, British history, to the original IRA in 1919 and Sinn Féin, Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time, said he would never talk to the murder gang, that he would defeat them militarily. 2 years later, he was reaching out, trying to get hold of Michael Collins, the leader of the organization, using someone actually very much like me, one of his aides, and starting the negotiation that led to the treaty. So every time we try and do something else first, and only when we realize there's no alternative, do we actually resort to talking to them. If we look at our experience in the case of Northern Ireland, John Major stood up in the British Parliament and said that he would never talk to Gerry Adams. It would turn his stomach to do so. And at that very moment, he was corresponding with Martin McGuinness, at that stage the commander of the IRA, trying to get to a peace agreement. And thank goodness he was, because if he hadn't have been, we would never have got to peace. So it is very difficult to do, and that's why largely governments do it secretly, just as the Spanish governments here always did with ETA, because every prime minister since Franco was negotiating with ETA, and every prime minister here denied that he was, even when they got to peace, which was slightly surprising, that last step. But that's why these negotiations usually start with secret back channels. In Britain, we had a secret back channel to the IRA from 1972 onwards, run by our intelligence service. We were able to communicate with them. We were even able to negotiate peace at different moments. There was a ceasefire in 1974, the settlement of the first hunger strike in 81, unfortunately not the second hunger strike. So you need to have that ability to have a secret contact so governments are not embarrassed if you're going to make negotiations work. And the same thing happened in Colombia that Sergio no doubt will talk about. I think there are two things in place if you're likely to succeed in negotiating as opposed to just talking to armed groups. I think the first is political leadership. You need to have people who are prepared to take a risk politically to try and bring about peace. If you think about South Africa, you'd have never had peace without a Nelson Mandela, someone really prepared to be humble, despite his background, all that he'd suffered, to reach out to the other side and make peace. But you wouldn't have had peace without F.W. de Klerk as well. You had to have leadership on both sides, people prepared to take a risk. That's certainly what we had in Northern Ireland with Bertie Ahern in Ireland, Tony Blair, but also with the politicians in Northern Ireland themselves, some of whom, like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, actually risked their lives to make peace, not just their careers. They could have been killed at any moment by dissident Republicans. And the second thing you need is a perceived mutually hurting stalemate, something the academics have given a horrible name to. And it's not just a stalemate. A stalemate by itself is not enough. It has to be something where both sides are hurting. If you think about Israel, now the wall has been built between Israel and the occupied territories, you don't have a mutually hurting stalemate and the chances of peace are not high. In Northern Ireland, we had a situation we could contain the IRA forever, but we were never going to wipe them out militarily. If we wanted to get to peace, to stop the violence, we had to talk to the men with guns, we had to bring about peace. And that's what we eventually did. The academics, by the way, also have a theory called ripeness, which I think is nonsense. You can't know if a conflict is ripe. It's not like a pear. You can reach up on a tree and see if it's ripe. You have to keep trying to make peace, even if it isn't the right time. You won't know if it's the right time until you've succeeded. So lastly, when would you not do this, as you asked, Christian? I think it's difficult to think of moments when you won't try, but sometimes people extend peace processes indefinitely, and they're counterproductive. The most obvious example is one Sergio again will probably talk about of Caguan in Colombia, where they kept it going and kept it going even though there was no chance, and it discredited the idea of peace. And actually in Palestine too, where you look as if you're managing the conflict by process, just keeping the process going indefinitely, with no real intention of reaching an agreement. So you can actually undermine the whole notion of peace if you're too cynical about the way that you keep a process going. But I think you can never know when a peace process will succeed, and usually they only succeed after lots of failures. In Northern Ireland, we had a failure in '73 with Sunningdale. We didn't include Sinn Féin, we didn't have an inclusive process, it failed. '85, the Anglo-Irish Agreement between Mrs. Thatcher and the Irish government failed. Downing Street Declaration, 1993, failed under John Major. But the Good Friday Agreement didn't come from nowhere. Seamus Mallon, who was the SDLP, the Catholic leader at the time, called the Good Friday Agreement Sunningdale for slow learners. It had the same measures in it as the Sunningdale Agreement, and we'd gone through 30 years of bloodshed before we came back to much the same agreement. So you do succeed in the end if you keep trying, and much the same, I think, is true of Colombia.
Creo que Jonathan mencionaba el Caguán ahora precisamente y creo que...
And I believe that one of the good things about the peace process in Colombia was the detailed analysis of the process, of previous processes, both in the country and the failed attempts, of course, but also internationally. Out of your own experience in Colombia, Sergio, to talk with the FARC was a taboo, and you had a deputy minister of defense. I mean, how did you navigate that political pressure, those tactic dilemmas, and humanitarian and political dilemmas at the same time? Well, thank you. Well, to start, I'd like to thank you for having invited me to come here. I'm so happy to be back in CITOP. And I thank you for this wonderful conference you organized, Paul, about Colombia in January 2017. It's such a pleasure to be with you, especially with Jonathan Powell, because we Colombians, we have an incredible debt with Jonathan. He's like an angel who came to Bogota to give us support in the negotiations. So the question in general about when can we talk with an armed group or with a terrorist group. I believe here we need to distinguish between having contacts. I'm in favor of having contacts. We should always have contacts. And Jonathan, even with greater authority than I, can talk about the case of the UK, in which there was always a back channel to talk to the IRA. But a very different thing is when you launch publicly a peace process, and above all, when this is done in a democracy, which is where I see the link between the UK and Colombia, because a peace process in a democracy is it affects society very much, and if it's not successful, it can actually have very bad effects, as happened in Caguán in Colombia. So, in my opinion, the statesman, the strategist, who has the driving wheel, he needs to coordinate some elements, and Jonathan mentioned a few of them. To start, I think it's obvious, but 4 or 5, clearly, you have to try and build up the conditions. We're talking about an armed conflict. We need to build up the political and military conditions that are favorable from the point of view of the Colombian government. That's what we try to do. And above all, to try and understand which is what President Santos did. Where is the window? Where is a window opening? And catch that opportunity, because that's how reality works. Opportunities appear, and if you do not catch them, whilst they may fly away. And Jonathan mentioned it. You need leadership. You need the will, the political will. You need the will to run risks. You need to be willing to run risks. But will is not enough. And in Colombia, we have good examples of presidents who, out of good faith, thought that with goodwill and being very voluntarists, they could actually get rid of the FARC. That didn't happen in the 80s or 90s. The president, and this is what President Santos also says, needs to be very realistic and needs to have a very firm hand in driving the wheel and needs to create the political conditions, which is the main challenge in democracy, to give support to that process. Then the third point is he needs to have an idea about the processes design. That's why I do not like the concept, and Jonathan mentioned it, of maturity, the ripeness. The concept of ripeness, because I believe there are always opportunities as long as the process is well designed. It is not enough just for the circumstances to look like they're ripe. No, you need to build up a process very, very meticulously for the organizations, for the negotiations with an armed group work out well. Fourth point, in a peace process, the past is the present. You need to know very clearly what we will do with everything that happened in the past. What will happen with all of this victimization? This was especially important in the case of Colombia. The level of victimization is enormous, the largest in the whole history of Latin America. It was impossible to have a peace process without that. And finally, the last point, last but not least, in democracy, you have to remember that you have the public opinion behind you, and you need to pay as much attention to what the electors will think, what the public will think, what voters will think, as much as what will be happening in the negotiating table. And you need to strike a permanent balance. That's why in democracy, like in Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, South Africa, or Colombia, I believe that it is a much harder process than in authoritarian regimes, because peace is at the very core of the political debate. It's at the very core of the political entity, and it makes everything really complicated. Sorry, Christian's, out of the 6 points, the most controversial one was transitional justice, right? And the victims. And what was, what would the FARC do after the war? Both of you have made a political and analytical approach of the dilemmas of negotiating. But if you'll allow me, now I'd like to go to the human realm and ask you, what are the moral dilemmas? Because at some point, one day comes into after having designed it all, you will have to sit face to face with the people you are negotiating with. I mean, in both cases, I mean, how do you manage that? How do you manage that individually from a human point of view?
a way of an anecdote. That I didn't feel particularly warm and cuddly about the IRA when I first had to meet Adams and McGuinness, along with Tony Blair in '97, and I refused to shake hands with them. Alistair Campbell, who was our press secretary, and I stood on one side of the table and refused to do so. Tony Blair, who was much more sensible, went and shook their hand. They had they'd shot my father and injured him in 1940. The IRA. They had put my brother, who worked for Mrs. Thatcher, on a death list for 8 years, and I'd spent a year in Washington trying to stop Jerry Adams getting a visa to come to Washington, something that in the end Bill Clinton gave him. But a few weeks after that meeting, I got a call from Martin McGuinness, who asked me to, out of the blue, called me at number 10 and said, would I come and visit him incognito in Derry and not tell the Securocrats, not tell the police and the army. And I wasn't sure about this, but I asked Tony Blair, and he said, yeah, go on, go, and don't tell anyone. So I got on a plane and took a taxi to Derry, stood on a street corner feeling slightly foolish, and two guys with shaved heads turned up, and they pushed me into the back of a black cab and said, Martin sent us. And they drove me around the town for about an hour till I was completely lost. And then they opened the door and chucked me out of the cab. And I knocked on the door of this little modern house, and Martin McGuinness came to the door on crutches and made a very unfunny joke about kneecapping, which was the IRA way of punishing people, where they would drill holes in their knees, their elbows, and their ankles. And I sat there for 3 hours in the house, which had been, the family had left, been told to leave, and we just sat there at a safe house. And we didn't make any breakthroughs at all, but what I understood was that if we were going to make peace, I had to be able to trust him, and he had to be able to trust me, and that meant I couldn't keep asking him to come to Downing Street or come to a castle in Belfast. I had to actually go on their turf. So I think it is very difficult, these things, but you do have to overcome the prejudices you may have and try and build that trust. Now, of course, that trust is not unlimited. Another anecdote, because Sergei will provide the intellectual input and I'll do the anecdotes. I remember negotiating with Martin McGuinness and Adams very late in a monastery in West Belfast in 2003. And I was very worried I was missing my plane. It was just before the Iraq War, and I had to get back to Downing Street. And the minute hand on my watch had come loose, and it was moving around, so I couldn't tell what the time was. I was very worried about this. And Martin McGuinness noticed, and he said, oh, well, give me your watch, and I'll get it fixed. There's a very good watchmaker just at the end of my street. And I said, no, Martin, honestly, you really don't need to bother. Please don't bother taking my watch. And he insisted, and he gave it back to me 3 weeks later at the negotiations at Leeds Castle. And I had to give the watch to our intelligence people to look for bugs and trackers in it. And they took it apart and broke the minute hand again, so it was broken, and I had to get it fixed at great expense. So there's a limit to the trust you can build. But I do think unless you can build that personal trust, it's really hard. And you're doing it with people who've killed other people. It's not something that's easy to do. And there are people in much worse situations than me having to do that, people who've really suffered. For me, it was tangential, but for real people who've really suffered, they have to sit down with the people who've spilled blood of their families and friends. And that is not easy. But if you don't do it, it's very hard to draw a line under these conflicts.
In my case, the first thing I would say is that, I can't think of any better description than the boring expression of a professional attitude, a very professional attitude to approach this thing. Given the design we had made of the process, we started out, as has happened in many other successful processes, in our case, possibly with greater intensity even, with 6 months of secret negotiations that allowed us to measure a bit where the others were standing on. And I mentioned this because, to start, the first thing we said was, we are here to solve the conflict. What happens in Colombia is still continuing. The war is continuing in Colombia. One of the main decisions made by President Santos is that there would be no ceasefire. We would not give them any military advantage until we were not absolutely sure that the process was reversible. And we were there, basically, with the attitude of saying, okay, here we are, ready to solve and to look forward. And if this is not solved here, then we will keep on doing what we're doing. On the other hand, we had full awareness about the fact that finally, the first thing and maybe the most important thing for a peace negotiation is to stop warfare and to save lives. And above all, in the case of Colombia, as I've already mentioned, to deal with the victimization of millions and millions of people, which was a good opportunity to value the suffering of so many people and to create a response, the right response, an adequate response. Sometimes I feel that in overly legal discussions in Colombia about the so-called transitional justice, you tend to lose sight of this human element. The first thing you have to do is to respond to the victims, and that's why we made a point of the victims in the agenda. And we took the victims to Havana. And I believe, Christian, to answer your question about the moral dilemmas, I believe this is what gave us the greatest strength. And at some point, I would say that it is the spiritual center of the negotiation to honor these victims solemnly to the government and to the FARCs, victims from all groups and state agents as well. And then we understood why we were there. We were there for that not to ever happen again so that they could get a response. The peace process in Colombia was quite innovative from many different points of view. One of them is the one you have just mentioned. I believe, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but never ever before both parties in the negotiating table had invited the victims to be present in the negotiating table. I don't know whether you want to say something about how you experienced that, those of you who were there, but the reality is that there were people who were victims from FARC, who had been kidnapped by the FARC, who looked straight into the eye of those who were responsible for the kidnapping. But there were victims of extrajudiciary murders who were looking at into the eye of the military who were there, the institutional military who had killed their children. So there were victims. And there was a very careful process from a representative of all victims. Now, this introduction, Sergio and Jonathan, I've made it to ask you the following. I want you to, looking backwards, I want you to think about the peace processes in Northern Ireland and in Colombia. 5 years have elapsed since the Colombian peace treaty, and this year, 23 years have elapsed since the Good Friday Agreement. Now, if we look back, what would you highlight on the design side of the negotiation, especially the interaction with the armed party? You know what? Which were the main achievements? And at the same time, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that nowadays you would have done differently? Sergio, given that the Colombian case is the most recent one, you can start. Well, it was an incredible experience. It was unheard of. I have to give credit here to the United Nations, to the National Colombian University and the Catholic Church, because of all of the hard work to coach these victims. First of all, we needed to select them. There was out of a universe of about 7 or 8 million victims, who will go to Havana? I mean, it's not both parties who will choose the victims. That would be absurd. So we defined some criteria, that it had to be a representation that would be plural of victims in Colombia. But to be honest, we did not expect that. And I remember not that long ago in Brussels, a great man came to visit me. He has become a great friend of mine, Leonard Palacios. He was one of the victims of this terrible, he was the victim. The church in Hokwachan was destroyed in his small village. And he survived that. And then they took FARC to forgiveness celebration. But years later, he told me, my brother, my little brother, I was not really sure about that process, but when I got into that hall, a big hall, very solemn hall in Havana, and I saw all of the delegations stand up. There was the church, And the countries, Cuba, the host, Norway, Chile, Venezuela, and everybody else, then I understood that it was real and that there was something real here. And that was the case. It was not a direct relationship between some proposals, which was part of the intention. I mean, that the victims said what they expected from the process, what was their vision, what they expected from us. But it was more than that. It was what I called, this moral force, this moral power that the victims from the process took with them. And then I thought it was the right decision. It was right, but it was sad that we didn't film any of this. We didn't film any of this so that nobody felt that it was like a movie shooting, so that nobody felt self-conscious. But that was a sad decision. I mean, how can nobody see in the future what we experienced? Even for the FARCs, a man who worked with me said that he went to the toilet because the sessions were very long. It happened, people had to go to the toilet. And he saw a woman from the FARC who was crying in a corner after having heard all of the testimonials. It was very, very hard indeed. And this is part of the living process in Colombia because, to deal with the past is a process with enormous consequences from an emotional point of view, but also from a political point of view. And it is still at the very center of the discussion, of the debate in Colombia. And there is a special commission created, which has already created many, many things. Many things have occurred in Colombia that have not happened anywhere else in the world. That the guerrilla warfare accepts to go to a court and that they recognize that they have actually committed crimes against humanity. And it's very strange that a general or an officer from a military, from an army, accepts certain conditions. And a European ambassador last week, listen, this is incredible. It's unheard of. But what's interesting is that this is something that Colombians understand. The political debate is so strong that we tend to miss what's going on. The role of the victims and reconciliation. Let's listen to the experience of Northern Ireland, and then we will come back to analyze in greater depth the results, the outcomes. How do we analyze the peace process with the benefit of hindsight? Jonathan.
What you described previously is that you yourself, in a way, had been a victim of the conflict, and in different levels as others, but still.
Firstly, I should say that, as always, Sergio is being too modest. He was the one who came up with the idea of inviting the victims, which was an inspired idea to actually take them to the table, something we never did in Northern Ireland, and most peace processes don't, and it was a breakthrough. In fact, in many ways, Colombia was a complete pathfinder in terms of how to deal with transitional justice and victims, and I might come back to that in talking about the Northern Ireland example. But just to answer your question, I think what the agreement gave us was the end of 30 years of civil war, and what it didn't give us is a fairy story. We don't live happily ever after just because we have a peace agreement. We have political crises, we have continuing violence, we have continuing sectarianism between Catholics and Protestants, but what we don't have and won't have again is a full-scale civil war. We're not going to go back to that. If I pick out three problems with it, ending with the one on victims, the first is that it's important to understand what the Good Friday Agreement was. It was an agreement to disagree. Many people in Northern Ireland want to remain in the United Kingdom, and many people want to be in a united Ireland. We did not resolve that issue in the agreement. What we provided was a basis on which people could live, practicing their identity in Northern Ireland, either as Irish or British or both, whichever they wanted. So this was not the finished product. It was an agreement to get people to pursue their political aims peacefully, not by violence. And maybe we'll come back to this in discussion later. That is the problem we now have, because Brexit has reopened that question, and the casual political vandalism of the current British government to the peace process has stirred the whole issue of identity up again in a very disturbing way. The second problem, when I look back at the peace agreement, is power sharing. We had to have power sharing because for the whole existence of Northern Ireland, it had been completely dominated by the Protestants who didn't allow the Catholics to have any say in politics, as described by the Unionist leader, David Trimble, at his Nobel Prize peace ceremony. He said we had made Northern Ireland a cold house for Catholics. We set up power sharing because we had to have some way of ensuring that Catholics could have a say in the future of the province. The problem with power sharing is once you insist that a forced coalition exists, which has both sides in it, you have no way of throwing the rascals out. Democracy depends on being able to throw the government out and bring in other people. Once you have a situation where people have to be in power regardless, then they can be completely incompetent. For example, we have a health crisis in Northern Ireland at the moment, but there's no way of remedying that through democratic politics because you can't throw out the people responsible for it because there's a forced coalition. This situation is far worse in places like Bosnia, where we have the same thing of power sharing. It's a really chronic problem in Bosnia that makes it impossible to ever get completely out of the aftermath of the war. It is a problem in Northern Ireland. There is no alternative to power sharing at the moment, but it is a real problem in managing it. And lastly, your point about how do you deal with victims, how do you draw a line under the conflict? And that's very topical in Northern Ireland at the moment because we were unable to find a way of doing that. We had a sort of amnesty in the Good Friday Agreement in that we allowed all prisoners to be released after 2 years, regardless of what they'd done. Any crimes before the Good Friday Agreement itself, you only serve 2 years. That solved some of the problem, but it didn't deal with the problem of people who had not yet been convicted of crimes before those years. And that problem has continued ever since to dog the peace process. We had Jerry Adams arrested for 3 days a few years ago and interrogated. We had elderly soldiers, 80-year-old soldiers, going to court in Northern Ireland, eventually the cases being dismissed. When we left government, we weren't able to establish a truth and reconciliation process, but we set up a commission headed by an archbishop, Eames, Protestant archbishop, and a former Catholic priest, Dennis Bradley. And they consulted all the parties in the hope of getting to a truth and reconciliation process that could draw a line, but it wasn't able to do so. All the parties, the Republicans, the Unionists, did not want to go back into history. They did not want to be telling the truth about what happened. So we weren't able to do it then. This has now come back to haunt us again because the government, the British government, has tried to introduce legislation initially to just pardon all soldiers, so just one side of the conflict, which clearly isn't going to work. They're now trying to find a way of drawing a line by just having an amnesty for everyone, but that's not acceptable to the victims, the people whose families were killed or maimed by one side or the other. We haven't found a way of trying to deal with it. It's become very controversial and will probably drag the peace processes again back into politics. It won't lead to the Troubles again, but it will lead to political instability. And this balance between the victims of the past and the victims of the future, if you like, is a very difficult one. In Colombia, as I'm sure Sergio will talk about, the transitional justice system is unique and is a complete experiment for the first time and a really important one. We didn't have that, but we had the same problem. You have to balance these things. You can't have purity in the way that you're dealing with victims. Everyone is going to be taken to court and given 30-year sentence. If you approach the FARC at the beginning of a peace process and say, we'd like you to engage in a peace process, but by the way, at the end of it, you're going to jail for 30 years. On the whole, they're not keen on such a peace process. You need to find a way of balancing, not creating new victims by having a peace process, but still providing information, truth, and some way of reconciling those who suffered during the conflict. It's a very difficult balance, but if you don't think of it as a balance, you'll really mislead yourselves and never actually get into a decent peace process.
Years later. Colombia no ha pasado tanto tiempo, pero también comentabas cómo el mundo saluda.
I've also mentioned how the world salutes Colombian innovations, but Colombian society has its own problems to manage these innovations. I imagine that it's very easy to identify the weaknesses of a peace process from the outside or from a distance or after some time. But a peace process or a peace agreement is the best thing that can be attained or achieved given the circumstances at that point. With time, circumstances may change and the windows of opportunity that you have referred to beforehand. But linking up with what Jonathan has just said and thinking about, after 5 years that have elapsed, with the benefit of 5 years of hindsight, with regards to the FARC, what would you actually highlight as the achievement? And now, with the benefit of hindsight, what do you think you should have done differently? What do you mean in general? Yes. Well, let me repeat again. I believe that, first of all, there was the right design, starting with the sequence I've already described. Some secret meetings to define acceptable parameters for society at large. I've also talked about a fully integrated strategy in which we coordinated the military component with the negotiation in a way that's very hard to carry out. And in the very negotiation, not only in the battlefield, but from the very onset, we tried to make sure that it was well coordinated, something that FARC had never accepted, i.e. that the outcome of the agreement had to be the immediate implementation and joint implementation of all of the things agreed on, including the disarmament of FARC, which they had never ever accepted beforehand. And that's why this was also quite innovative, surveilled by the Security Council. That was really exemplary. We have already talked about the victims, and I would like to highlight as well 2 additional elements. The fact that in Colombia, we tried to learn from the lessons of the past, but above all, our own mistakes. You need to be the owner of your own peace process. The international community may give you the support, but they cannot substitute you. They cannot drive the wheel. And we Colombians had the driving wheel. Then we were very careful with the international structure. And then there are details. The delegation chosen by President Santos for the public phase, it was a delegation with some very important people involved. I would like to highlight Humberto Lacalle, the old president of Colombia, a man with an enormous prestige who led all of this with his enormous wisdom. He went through important things like the constitutional movement in Colombia, the presence of the military commander with the highest reputation in Colombia in the same delegation, and the presence of active military men in the delegation. These added together with a methodology that these worked out. Where were the limitations? Where was the limit? Why was the peace process in Colombia so difficult? Well, the politics and public debate, all of the debate surrounding, and the use of a referendum that we had, because people do not understand it. Brilliant academics write down and they say, well, they were absolutely ignorant people. How did they agree to have a referendum? And if you look it up in the internet, why we did it, you will see that. But I want to insist on the importance for the negotiation to have followed that idea. From the very onset, we knew it would be difficult. So the referendum, the people's referendum, was a limit that we imposed on ourselves. As constitutionalists, we would tie our own hands, saying that in this negotiation will never be accepted by Colombians, so we cannot have a referendum. Now, the problem, and I'm coming back to this, is that in democracy, a peace negotiation is at the very core of the political debate. And I am fully convinced, and I've studied this very much, as you may well imagine, because I'm interested, not to say that I'm obsessed with it. I believe that the only exception is the case of Israel-Palestine, where a peace process has had such a ferocious opposition like the one we had in Colombia by ex-President Álvaro Uribe. In the case of Israel, as you all know how Netanyahu behaved in the 90s, and with Rabin, etc., and what happened afterwards. So, as a result, things become extremely difficult. And they are part of the political game. They are part of the political game. There are very many vested interests, very many political vested interests. And then you're surprised with things like 2 days before the referendum, and in 2 days' time, 5 years will have elapsed since the referendum in Colombia. Well, President Uribe made Colombians vote for a peace without impunity and against the agreement. And 5 years later, he told to the president of the Commission on Truth, why don't we think about a general amnesty? You know, let's start anew. I mean, we're playing a power game here, a political power game in democracy.
It's relevant also to things that have happened in Spain. And that is what we found in Northern Ireland. One of the reasons we were able to make peace was because we had a policy of bipartisanship. That was when Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party, he supported what John Major was doing to make peace in Northern Ireland, even when we disagreed with what he was doing. We just decided that was the right thing to do. And when we won and went to number 10 and the Tories took over, more or less, they supported what we did in Northern Ireland. That made it much easier to make peace in Northern Ireland. When I observed the peace process here with ETA, for the socialist government, it was incredibly difficult because of the approach of crispation adopted by the PP government, or opposition at the time, and then government. They made it as hard as possible for the socialist government to make peace. And the same thing happened in Colombia with Uribe. And I find that very difficult to understand, why you would play politics with that kind of peace. It just seems a very irresponsible thing to do. And it just makes it almost impossible for people to acknowledge that they're trying to make peace and to make the necessary concessions to stop people being killed or to get the weapons back. And I really think that's an important lesson from both of our processes, that bipartisanship makes it easier and crispation makes it almost impossible.
All right. Time to move on to a completely different scenario and context, away from liberal democratic context, and to Afghanistan, which for obvious reasons has made the headlines. And the global war on terror, I think, started and ended probably in Afghanistan with a time frame of 20 years. But it started with President Bush saying, there's only two options, you're with us or against us, and we'll never talk to terrorists, like so many other governments have said in the past. And then some years later, they started their secret talks with the Taliban, which went on for several years and eventually led to an agreement, which then was supposed to enable direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but that never fully worked very well. I didn't mention in the introduction that both of you have been involved in the peace process in Afghanistan. You've been advising the Afghan government on their approach. There's so much to analyze and reflect on, but based on your personal experience and on the topic we are addressing in the discussion today on the issue talking to terrorists, what would you like to share? Would it have been wiser for the Americans to engage with the Taliban immediately after they were defeated in 2001 and find an honorable defeat for them? Should they have done something different when they engaged them later Could the Afghan governments have done something different? In any case, I think we all know something of the violence and the conflict in Afghanistan. We know very little about the efforts of doing peace. So whatever actually you want to share from your own personal experience.
So, you know, I work very closely together on this, sharing the lessons we've both learned from our individual peace processes with particularly the Afghan government and the Afghan negotiating team during the process. I think I've written quite a lot about this just recently because the 20th anniversary of the war on terror is quite a good opportunity to think about the mistakes that we made and try and learn some lessons from it rather than repeating them for another 20 years. And there are all sorts of things we could talk about, from intervention to the use of drones and so on. But let's just focus on the peace negotiations aspect of it this evening. And I think I'd pick out three things in Afghanistan. The first was the mistake right at the beginning, and I'm as much to blame for this as anyone else. I was in government at the time. I could have done something different. But 2001 to 2004, when the Taliban were defeated, they sued for peace. They wanted to be brought back. They wanted to be able to go back to their villages. They wanted to be able to be involved in the discussions about the future of Afghanistan, and we could have given them a stake in the new Afghanistan. And the Americans told President Karzai that he couldn't do that. They were going to chase the Taliban till they finished them off. And they retreated across the border into Pakistan, regrouped, and started the war. And it's a classic mistake of victor's justice that you think, because you've won, exclude the people who've been defeated and just make peace with those who you like. And that doesn't work. It doesn't lead to a lasting peace any more than it did from the Versailles Peace Treaty in 1919. We made the mistake again in 2008. In 2008, there were opportunities the Taliban were ready to talk. There could have been a negotiation before the Taliban were fully back in the military success that they had subsequently. It was rejected by a Labour government in Britain and a Democratic government in the United States because they didn't want to talk to people who didn't respect women's rights and didn't believe in the education of girls. I totally agree with them about the issue, but is that a reason not to talk to people? Because if you're not prepared to negotiate with them, how do you think you're going to persuade them of a different point of view? So we missed the opportunity there. Then in 2014, the American government started negotiating with the Taliban about Bowie Bergdahl, the soldier who had been kidnapped. And they went for a transactional negotiation rather than a political negotiation. They then morphed that under President Trump into a negotiation where essentially President Trump wanted to get out, and it was perfectly obvious all he was doing was trying to get out. And in those circumstances, why would the Taliban negotiate seriously? Why not just insist on what they actually wanted? And the negotiator was constantly undercut by President Trump tweeting during the negotiations. So I don't think there was much of a prospect of a serious negotiation then, not least because they didn't start the negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban in parallel to the American negotiations with the Taliban. There was a last opportunity for peace, I think, when President Biden came to office, and actually Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, said at the time that they would impose conditionality, that they would pull out of Afghanistan, but they'd only pull out if the Taliban fulfilled their promises on negotiating with the government and on not attacking the cities. And the Taliban didn't do either of those things, and yet President Biden decided himself to remove that conditionality. He said, we are leaving, and I will not insist on any conditionality. The Taliban relaxed. Why negotiate in those circumstances? So there were chances to negotiate all the way through, and we missed those chances. And the Afghan government's delegation tried really very hard. There were discussions on issues that could have found a way through, informal discussions in Doha, but they never were able to be realized because of the bigger picture that I've described. So again, I think it's an example of a missed opportunity and a need to understand that I think the Taliban are about to make the same mistake as we made in 2001. Instead of going for an inclusive settlement where they involve everyone, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Hazara, they're going for just themselves in power. And that would be an equally terrible mistake as we made in 2001 and will lead eventually to another civil war unless they change their mind about that. And there are things we can do about that, which we could discuss later, but that, I think, for me, are the mistakes.
¿Qué nos quieres compartir?
What would you like to share with us, Sergio? Well, I have an even harsher vision than Jonathan, because what has happened in Afghanistan is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for the Afghans, for people who have left and for people who live there. More than 30 million who live in Afghanistan nowadays. And if you look back during the past 20 years, as Jonathan has told us, it is a story of missed opportunities. In 2001, when we met in Bonn, it's very serious what happened when the USA and NATO were in the maximum point of deployment and power. Some people insisted at the State Department to do something much more serious from a negotiation point of view. And the military themselves said, no, this is not ripe enough. This is not the right time. This is what shows, in my opinion, the consequences of September 11, which militarized American politics. And this is a system that's broken inside. Those who actually led the parade were the military, and that had a consequence in the decision of Biden, of President Biden. The military are leading, and that's what made more opportunities being missed in 2010 than the direct negotiation with them, which was a practically impossible negotiation, because under Donald Trump, you can imagine how people negotiated. But at any rate, I believe that at least two additional crucial mistakes were made, beyond not including the Afghan government I mean, the Taliban were treated as if they were sovereign, and they asked guarantees that Afghan soil was not used by terrorists, as if they were the state, as if they were not the terrorists. And we're treating you like state representatives and not the Afghan government, and we will limit the use of our force. We will leave you the power. And to them, the situation was already very favorable, so that when the new government comes in, it was very difficult. And yet, as usual, we should not let yourself be confused by history, because opportunities crop up, and what Jonathan and I witnessed was the very last opportunity. When Afghans, and I'm very moved by this, the Afghans made an incredible effort to organize their delegation to learn, but they were left alone. They were left completely alone. Because the USA renounced to having an integral strategy in which they said, okay, let's condition our exit to the fact that at least there is a roadmap, a minimum roadmap. And they had an option. They clearly had an option, which to me was, okay, if this doesn't happen, we will leave unilaterally, but you will not gain anything with these results. And what this shows is that the West does not really care about Afghan people. To the West, the priority is the guarantees against terror, and nowadays in Europe, the concern about the potential migration to Europe with all of the consequences. What about the Afghan people? Nobody gives a damn about the Afghan people, and that really breaks your heart with what's going on now. Well,
Afghan issue.
Before
we open the floor to questions.
Just very briefly, I mean, the story isn't over. We may have left Afghanistan, but Afghanistan's not about to leave us. We in Europe are going to face, if we just let it go, a humanitarian disaster. We will face the consequences in terms of drugs, in terms of refugees, in vast numbers already gathering in Western Afghanistan, and in terms of terrorism, because Al-Qaeda are already back in Afghanistan. And we were the ones who are going to suffer from that unless we have an active policy. And part of that policy will be exactly this difficult issue, moral issue we've been talking about tonight. If we don't engage with the Taliban, there will be a catastrophe in Afghanistan. If we do engage with the Taliban, then are we really going to prop up a regime that does not respect the rights of women, does not believe in girls' educations? We're caught in a really difficult place. And again, I think for me the answer is yes, of course we should engage with them, but we don't reward them, we don't, we make sure the people can eat, we make sure the government can function, but we don't reward them unless they actually do move towards an inclusive government. So our demand should not be about counterterrorism alone. It should also be about them including the rest of Afghanistan in the government in the hope of getting to a situation which is likely to produce a lasting peace. We have an interest. We have a very strong vested interest in a lasting peace in Afghanistan. That's not going to happen suddenly. It's not going to happen by a negotiation. It's going to happen over time. But if we just turn our backs on Afghanistan, we will live to regret that very much indeed.
¿Qué margen, Sergio, queda ahora?
The leeway that we have in Afghanistan, Sergio, nowadays, or are we doomed to a new cycle of violence? I mean, this is probably very frustrating. Well, this is nothing compared to what will happen now. But there are elements of what was built up that could be adopted in the international positioning with Afghanistan. Because let's not forget that what happened was something incredible. We see the collapse of a country, and here we have all of these special correspondents talking as if it was a football match. I mean, you guys negotiate. I mean, what happened was really surreal. And then the last meetings, the last international meetings we had in Doha during the first and second week of August, in which all neighboring countries were present, the most important group, the Troika Plus group, the USA, Russia, and China, and Pakistan were there. The European countries and the United Nations and the European Union were present, and they committed publicly to a number of principles. any solution for Afghanistan had to include an inclusive government. It had to include the human rights, especially women's rights. It had to include a mechanism so that of a representative government. And there was also a declaration, the last one they made jointly, all of these countries, Turkey included, that they were all in Qatar, the host country. They said they would not recognize any government that was the outcome of a military result. Well, gentlemen, you all said that. So let's see how that works now. And it is here, you know, the devil is in the detail. How can that be translated? With great difficulty, because to be honest, the leverage that the West has in Afghanistan nowadays is quite limited. But at least we could have a framework to talk. Okay, I'm going to do a number of things based on the understanding I have of what should happen. I'm very pessimistic with regards to what will happen in Afghanistan, but I do not share the vision of some who say that, well, now we have a regime that manages Afghanistan with a firm hand. That's not going to be the case. The Taliban government is a Pashtun government. It's excluding, it's incompetent, ignorant. They will run into all sorts of difficulties. And we have to do what was not done beforehand, i.e. to have an fully integrated strategy and to be very sly as to how we can use the very few carrots and sticks we have left in that process. Sergio, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. So this is the end of the first block of questions asked by me. And now I'm going to give you the floor. Please introduce yourselves, give your name, and ask short questions. And please say if the question is addressed to Jonathan or to Sergio. We will have different rounds. I see 1, 2, 3 hands raised. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Montserrat Radigales. I'm a journalist. I was actually back in the 80s and 90s London correspondent. I cover quite a lot of Northern Ireland. And I have two questions for you, Mr. Powell. The first one is, when do you think, talking about when to negotiate and when not to negotiate, do you think that times of extreme crisis, I'm thinking, for example, the time of the hunger strikes, is it best to negotiate, not to negotiate? At that time, that crisis led to the back channel being reactivated in a way, and obviously the British government seemed not to make the concessions, but once the prisoners were demanding, but once the hunger strike finished, actually most of the concessions were granted. And the second question is what you were mentioning now, how to draw a line, and all the current controversy about forgetting all the past cases and granting total amnesty and all that. That's a delicate question I'm going to put to you. That's a difficult one. Because one may think that from the process of possible trials, things might emerge that the British state may not want to emerge. I mean, there's been already quite a lot known about collusion between the security forces and the Unionist paramilitaries, and there were the Stevenson inquiries and all that. To what extent that is part of the problem? Sorry, thank you.
There's another one, somewhere in the back. No? Yes, there.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Borja Palladini. Una pregunta para Sergio y Jonathan.
With Jonathan, please, well, if Jonathan wants to say something, welcome. One of the challenges of negotiating with terrorists is that you end up negotiating substantial issues that are important for society and that you can't escape from negotiating and from agreeing with society. Thinking about the future of peace processes, and maybe thinking about the case of LLN in Colombia, wouldn't it make sense to have rationales of peace process designs to have local and national dialogues in order to negotiate the substantial agenda that will be defined, and only sideways to negotiate with the armed group with an agenda more focused on how they will be part of the social change process without arms that will be agreed on. Any further questions, please? Well, these two questions have been quite intense. So let's start answering these first two questions, and then we will carry on. Would you like to start?
Given your background, very good questions. Let me start with the second one and then come to the first one. As I say, this is a very live problem in Britain today because the Conservative government have put forward some proposals which are rejected by all of the parties in Northern Ireland, the Unionists, Nationalists and Republicans, and by the Irish government, and they've handled the whole issue appallingly. But they are wrestling with a real problem, which is we need to stop these things going back to court because they never produce any satisfaction for someone. If you have a court case 40 years after the event, it's very hard to prove anything. So there is a real reason we need to deal with the problem. They've gone about it the wrong way, but this has got to be dealt with. How far is a worry about state collusion? To be honest, state collusion now doesn't affect any people in government, even from our time. It was all before we came to government. So I don't think that's what's compelling people. There were specific problems. I dealt, for example, the case of the Finucane family. You'll be familiar with that. And I met the Finucane family, and I found their case very difficult to deal with because the loyalists had assassinated this lawyer who'd been the lawyer for IRA prisoners, believing him to be an IRA member, and done so clearly with collusion with security forces. I tried to set up a situation we could have a proper inquiry that all the facts could be brought out on it, but the problem was that the security services were worried that the agents who were still alive would find themselves revealed, and in those circumstances they'd be killed in revenge killings. So there was a genuine problem about how to deal with that. That problem is much less the case now, and there is an inquiry going on under a chief constable looking at how we can deal with some of these problems from the past and actually find non-judicial ways of dealing with them. He's actually looking into the whole question of collusion. My own judgment, I don't know, because I never looked at the detail, is that there was clearly some collusion involving the army and police, but I don't think there was security service, i.e. our MI6, MI5 probably weren't involved in any of that stuff, nor the politicians, is my judgment, but no, why would anyone take my word? So you're right, it's an issue, but I don't think it's the issue stopping us resolving the problem now, because so much time has passed. Your first question on crises, and is that the right time to start a negotiation? I mean, specifically on the hunger strikes, what's interesting is that the first hunger strike was resolved by a guy called Michael Oatley, who was a member of SIS, who went to the airport at Belfast to negotiate with some Catholic priests on behalf of the IRA, and they came up with a solution that stopped the first hunger strike. The problem was Mrs. Thatcher then put her foot down and wouldn't agree when they tried to negotiate to stop the second hunger strike, and absolutely refused, and that went wrong. I think the general point, though, is a good one. I think quite often when there's a crisis is a good time to start a negotiation like this, because there's more flexibility. When the cards are all in the air, there's more chance of making progress when things are really stuck and have been going along in the same way for a very long period of time. It isn't always the case, but that is when you sometimes have an opportunity to make progress. I'll let Sergio take the other one, but I wouldn't mind commenting on that afterwards.
Okay, with regards to the first question, I'd like to say something too. Because I feel that this is very important for a peace process to work, especially transitional processes that look back into the past. You have to start out from being realistic. Any state that faces, and you may use the description you want, a terrorist group, insurgents, guerrilla warfare, necessarily they will find certain levels of collusion in their ranks with those who are attacking those organizations. Basically, because this is an information warfare. And I suspect that there was much more collusion than Jonathan has mentioned in this country, Spain too. So when you look at what really happened, and it is here where you have to be very, very refined with your explanation, because that doesn't mean that anybody is on the same footing. But a state has a hard time to recognize the damage they themselves have actually caused. And what happened in Colombia is that it was very hard for us to find a solution because of the government. Well, it was the government, and President Santos said, yes, we are also guilty of certain crimes, and we're ready to look into the eyes of the victims of all of the perpetrators, including ourselves. In European countries, that has never existed. The very sad collusion that existed in Colombia has not happened here. I mean, and it's not only my own vision, but I know it firsthand. You know, military and policemen who were strengthened and professionalized, and that reduced the collusion. But it existed. And to face that for a state, it is very difficult, it is very hard. Even if it's from a distant past, it is always unacceptable. But even without that, you cannot take a real step to have a feasible framework for a solution to treat the past. In Borja's question, and he doesn't say anything about himself, but Borja knows Colombia much better than all of us, because he was for many, many years in one of the hardest regions in the country, in the borderline with Ecuador, right, Borja? It's a very difficult question for a country like Colombia. I mean, what is legitimate to negotiate? The solution we found with FARC was the concept of we're here to end the war and to assure that it will not be repeated. And that implies that we have to touch upon issues that go beyond the disarmament. On the one hand, because the government was interested in agreeing things that would stop the continuity of violence in rural areas, and secondly, because no guerrilla warfare after 50 years sits down with the government to say, okay, where should we leave the arms? Where should we leave the weapons? No, they have their own ambitions. Now, you mentioned the case of LLN, Borja, which has a very different structure from FARC. And the famous proverb, you have never fought the last war. In our case, LLN is a much more regional issue, and there may be issues like the ones mentioned by Borja, but I would go back to this limitation, which returns us to the discussion about the referendum, which was part of the reason why we said, okay, listen, this is in the hands of Colombians, so that they give their opinion about what we agreed on, because necessarily we had to go beyond, within certain limitations, with a limited agenda, but we had to go beyond what would normally be a disarmament negotiation, and to touch issues that will actually affect the rest of society. And so, legitimately, following the classical spirit, we asked the country, what do you think? And we developed what do you think about a large rural development program to include everybody? What do you agree? What do you think about all of these measures to strengthen the democratic participation? And what do you think about this solution with regards to transitional justice for the victims? There is no other solution. There was no other solution.
To this whole subject. And funnily enough, it was a subject that Sergio and I spent a lot of time talking about when we first met, because this was the fundamental issue you had to decide with the FARC and the agenda for the talks with the FARC. And I'd had experience of it both in Northern Ireland and then in the ETA negotiations. In Northern Ireland, I mean, we didn't actually ever negotiate with the IRA as such. We negotiated with Sinn Féin, which had this convenient political device of being a political party. And Mo Mowlam, who was our very colourful Northern Ireland secretary, used to say that when Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness said they were going to go and consult the IRA, they left the room, looked in the mirror and came back again. It wasn't actually as simple as that. They had to go and talk to the Army Council, which brought together very many different people. But it would not have been right for us, I think, to negotiate political issues like human rights, like the Irish language, with the IRA. That would have been wrong. But to negotiate it with Sinn Féin as well as with the SDLP, the Women's Coalition, the unionist parties, was the right thing to do. And when I first became aware of the ETA negotiations, I was slightly worried that they seemed to be negotiating political substantial issues that belonged to the whole Spanish people, or at least the whole people in the Basque region, with an armed organization. Actually, in the end, the negotiation wasn't about that. It was about what Sergio says, ending the armed conflict. It was about the consequences of the conflict in terms of weapons and victims and so on. What you run into trouble with nearly every armed group is they want to talk about the causes of the conflict. And once you go down that path, in my view, you're lost, because you're going to talk about everything. And that is the problem with the ELN. That's the real problem with starting talks with the ELN, because that's what they want to talk about, and don't want to talk about it for a very long time.
All right. Rafael, y després...
Raphael, and then you had also raised your hand, hadn't you? Fine, thank you both. Very interesting indeed. I'm going to try and make your lives difficult. You have not talked about dialoguing with terrorists. You have talked about peace negotiations. Therefore, negotiations and dialoguing with groups that acted with terrorist behaviors, but they had political goals. Only in the final phase in Afghanistan, there has truly been discussed. So my specific questions are as follows. What difference do you make between having a dialogue and having a negotiation? And do you agree with the fact that there can't be a negotiation without creating previously a space, channels, mechanisms of trust and efficient dialoguing? Second question, terror. There is no way to define legally terrorism for more than 40 years, as you well know. Therefore, it is defined... my name is Rafael Grasa from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Therefore, you define terrorism as a behavior. And therefore, there are groups like the LPO, IRA, FARC, who use terrorist behaviors, but they can't be defined as terrorist groups constantly. And this is especially important as well. After the killing of anarchist groups in the 19th century, the magnicides, and after September 11, 2001, there is a new type of terror that appears on stage, which is the one described by Joseph Conrad in The Secret Agent, which is the type of terror that wants to end with the system, but they do not ask for anything in exchange. You cannot have a negotiating agenda or a negotiating table, and this is basically what we see with Al-Qaeda. This is what I mean. In my opinion, in Afghanistan, there hasn't been a negotiation, peace negotiations. There has been negotiations. There have been conversations and diplomatic conferences. But do you believe that you can truly have a dialogue and truly have a negotiation with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda? Islamic State would look more like the other ones. And final question, partial mediation, i.e. non-objective mediation, was key in South Africa. It was crucial through the South Africans. In the case of Northern Ireland, as Jonathan knows, and it was clear in the Basque Country internally. In Colombia, as far as I know, there hasn't been an internal mediation, except with some businessmen and forces from the government from that perspective. Is it true that there has been an internal negotiation in Afghanistan, or an internal mediation in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Three, or at least six.
Well, that's the speciality. Questions and sub-questions.
Do you want to go first? Well, I agree with many of your points, but not all. And I'm not quite sure where to, let me start here. So, yes, in my view, there is a difference between dialogue and negotiations. And it's not always the right time for negotiations, but it's nearly always the right time for dialogue if you can do it. That's why we had a channel to the IRA from 72 onwards, so that we could use it when we needed to use it. And it only developed into negotiations in a few rare but crucial moments, and particularly when John Major became Prime Minister. So yes, there is a difference. I think, and I do draw a distinction between different different terrorist groups. I don't think I draw a distinction as much as other people do between the four waves of terrorism. We had anarchism and nihilism, liberation terrorism, leftist terrorism, and now the religious terrorism is the fourth wave that we're facing. I think in each of those waves there were people you could negotiate with, But there are also people there would be no point in negotiating with. I would not think there was any point in negotiating with Baader-Meinhof. They did not have sufficient political support to be worth negotiating with. I would not negotiate with the dissident Republican terrorists that remain in Northern Ireland because they have no political support. You know, Sinn Féin were getting 20% of the vote in Northern Ireland, the Catholic vote in Northern Ireland, even at the height of the Troubles, even when they were killing people. So they had real political support. Where I might disagree with you is that I don't believe that necessarily Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups like that have no political support. Certainly we have managed to negotiate peace with some Islamist groups, with the GAM in Aceh, with MILF in Philippines, and there was a real negotiation of sorts with the Taliban. It didn't work for the reasons I've given, but there were, in the private meetings between the government and the Taliban, there were real discussions of real issues that will come back at some stage to be the solutions. So the distinction I make is between groups that have genuine political support and those that don't. And although we might like to think ISIS doesn't have political support, and we might like to think we've driven ISIS out of its territory in Syria and Iraq, it's still there. It's still reorganizing, and at some stage, unless we address the Sunni-Shia issue, the feeling that the Sunnis have been dispossessed in both Syria and Iraq, we're not going to solve the problem. So there will have to be a discussion between someone and someone about that issue. And interestingly, when you look at Al-Qaeda around the world, or even the groups that say they're ISIS, like in Nigeria and in Mozambique, but aren't really, there are real things you can talk about. With Shabab in Somalia, they are transactional issues that you can negotiate, and they represent a real strand of opinion that you can have a negotiation with. Doesn't mean you'll succeed, but it's worth trying. So that's the distinction that I would try and draw. Yes, absolutely. Boko Haram have transactional issues that they want to talk about, and that's, yes, exactly.
And the support, the political
support?
support?
They have genuine political support, or they wouldn't have such large numbers with them. Many are kidnapped, but not all. Some of them are people who actually share their view, often for reasons of revenge. Their parents are being killed by the security forces or whatever it might be.
Right.
A ver, todas esas preguntas tan inteligentes de Rafael.
Goodness, Rafael and his very clever questions. Okay. To negotiate or to have a dialogue, you may give them the classification you may want. I'm going to deal with this with a different perspective, because for Colombia, it is strategic and very much present. The criterion, okay, this armed organization, what does it look for? What do they want? If this armed organization is an organization that has as a goal, it wants to reach power. If it wants to reach power, I leave aside the crimes it has committed, etc., and I have a framework within which I may have some way to have a dialogue with them. I'm not forced by any means, but I can have it. I can have the conversation. But to fine-tune the concepts, I think we need to go to another extreme, organized crime, which is also strategic in Colombia. Nowadays, in Mexico, there are cartels, drug cartels for many, many years, who have a total deployment over a territory. They control full territories that have nothing to envy those guerrillas in South America. You have seen some of the images in Sinaloa, for example. So the question is, okay, well, then somebody could say objectively, 6R. I was involved in that discussion many, many years ago. They could say, well, the level of control and weapons deployment they have is enormous, but strategically, from the point of view of the state, no. These gentlemen are not pursuing any goal. What they're doing is to just get rich. And this is very important to distinguish. I mean, to know where the next move will be. I control this territory, I create some logistics, and I get some means in order to attain this goal, or is it the other way around? I'm controlling this territory to get some funds and to become rich with illegal activities. If that's the case, there is no peace negotiation. And I may look like a historical guerrilla, even more powerful than others. And this is the case of Mexican cartels, but I cannot negotiate with them because I'm destroying the state of law if I do. And then I go to the other case. the so-called, there are examples of historical examples. The first one is obvious in all languages. If you need two to tango, basically. I mean, you need two to tango. If the other one is not ready to negotiate, there is nothing you can do. What I would say is, okay, with this organization, is there a political framework, a state-based political framework in which we can have some transactional demands, as Jonathan has just said, or no? And there could be chapters of these organizations, like in Africa, where this could be the case, and there could be cases in which it's impossible. If Al-Qaeda, as it looks like, is a nihilist project, there is nothing to discuss with them. What's the framework? There is no possible transaction with them, but we always have to look for whether something is possible. In the case of the Taliban, there is there is the shameful historical mistake. It looks like we have not learned from the past, in spite of the fact that American generals quote the past very much, but they did not learn anything. I mean, these gentlemen, first of all, they created the enemy themselves, and then they have a power project. You have to play the game and play it hard. You need to play it hard with negotiations, and at the end, it was practically impossible because the political project is a project that's very distant, and to build bridges between Republican values and their idea of an Arab emirate, an Islamic Arab emirate, was very difficult. But always in negotiations, there are opportunities that open up. There are always interest opportunities, and somehow there is a representation. You have to be very careful with what I'm about to say. And I'm not assigning a political representation of Talibans to Talibans, but there was a shock between the culture that has developed in the city world in Afghanistan and the rural Afghanistan. And it's not difficult to imagine things that you may invent to say, okay, within this framework, we could reach some agreements. There's another question here, and another one over there. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. For those of us who are following us through the streaming, if you want to ask a question through the chat box, please go ahead. My name is Ricardo Fizes. First of all, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting indeed. We could spend all night long here asking and asking. I have 3 quick questions. The first one is out of curiosity. In all war process, I believe there must be people who are very much interested in continuing the war and not having peace. I'm thinking about, weapons producing lobbies, etc. Are they kept in mind? Do you talk to them? Those weapon manufacturers and other political actors who are not interested in peace. Now, with regards to terrorism, I'd like to know your opinion. You have talked to FARC, and you have talked to the Afghanistan. In the West, we always talk about terror groups, the FARC, etc. What is their vision? Because to them, probably the terrorists are the Colombian government at some point, and for the Afghan people, 150,000 civilians have been killed by the Western forces. The Western forces, therefore, are the terrorists to them. So what's the view on the other side of the fence? And after so many years, and it must be difficult because each situation is a different one, what surprises you still in these negotiation processes? What still surprises you? Well, there are different questions, and then let's answer them, and then we will go back to the other 2 people who have raised their hands. Sergio always wants Jonathan to start. Oh, come on, Sergio. Why do you want Jonathan to start?
Your question, which I didn't answer, which is, I agree, terrorism is not a particularly useful term. In fact, my book in English is called Talking to Terrorists. I was going to call it Talking to Non-State Armed Groups Who Use Violence for Political Aims. And my publisher said I couldn't get that on the front page, so I couldn't call it that. But you're right that terrorism is essentially a tactic, and it can be used by governments like Iran, it can be used by individuals like people who go and stab people on the street, it can be used by groups. So trying to categorize people as terrorists doesn't really help because you're just taking a tactic and applying it to people. But it's used loosely to refer to our enemies. What we say terrorism, what we mean is enemies who use methods we don't like, and often really horrible methods that stir our publics up very much indeed. So I agree that it's not a particularly useful term in itself, and often can be very, can cause real problems. In Nepal, for example, the United States categorized the Nepali Maoists as terrorists, and as a result, when they won the election, it was impossible for the American government to talk to them. So it can have very paradoxical, and here in Europe, we also, by categorizing people as terrorists, make it impossible for those of us who want to talk to them and try and make progress to talk to them here, or very difficult to talk to them there because of the rules we apply, which aren't applied by Norway and Switzerland and people like that. So we sometimes make a mistake ourselves in using that categorization. In terms of spoilers, as I would call them, people who have a vested interest in the conflict going on, that's nearly always the case in every conflict. You know, for soldiers don't want to admit to being defeated, they'd rather have just one more go, one more go, one more go. If you take Myanmar, where I've been working for a very long time, the Tatmadaw, the army, have a strong vested interest in the war going on because that's why they get a budget for a completely disproportionate budget. They have a vested interest individually because they make money from the illegal jade mines that can exist when they're fighting the ethnic armed groups. And even if you take it at a more basic level, if you go to the Niger Delta, you're taking young men who are living on less than $1 a day, and if they take up weapons, they're earning $100 a day, and their status goes up within society. So they have a vested interest. I remember Aung San Suu Kyi saying to me in Burma, we're never going to solve this problem unless we resolve the war economy. That's actually the wrong way to think about it, because you can never go in and resolve the war economy and then deal with the political issues. You've got to try and deal with both at once and try and find a way of incentivizing those who are benefiting from the war economy to actually to stop, to see that they can also benefit from peace. And if nothing else, at least they're not going to die, because usually making money out of the war economy is a very dangerous thing to do for your survivability. So it's not an easy thing to do. You have to think about it. But if you say, we'll deal with that first, it almost never works. And as for surprise, I'll leave that to Sergio.
Sobre
Okay, if I understand your question well, I mean, those who have a vested interest in continuing the war, in countries like Colombia, this may have been the biggest challenge. I'm leaving aside the politicians who have an interest in continuing the war. And let me focus on all of the criminal world that is interested in keeping certain conditions. And part of the solution in Colombia, as Jonathan has just said, is to distinguish between who may I negotiate with, or at least take that part out of the violence, the historical structural violence that has had the greatest political impact. To use an expression that in Colombia resonates wrongly, but to put things in the right proportion. I mean, what should have happened in this next step? And the current government, because it's ideologically blindfolded, I mean, the idea that the historical conflict is over, but there are still many pockets of violence, and I need to reformulate all of my security strategy to see how these gentlemen work who do not work in the same way as FARC did. There are limits. With all of this world of drug dealing, there are certain instruments in justice, in the justice system, but there is no negotiation. And part of the art of governing is to understand, to place everything in its right place and to use the right instruments you have at hand. Now, with regards to the question as to how they saw us, how do they see us on the other side of the fence, I'm going to say something that I noticed as far as I could understand and study in the case of the Taliban. It is probably something shared in common by many insurgent guerrilla groups. They themselves, they have faced the state, strong and powerful states like in Colombia. But in the case of Afghanistan, it's a different level, because in Colombia, as opposed to Afghanistan, we were much more careful in the use of the air raids, air fire. They tend to see themselves as victims. They see themselves as victims. A recurrent topic amongst Taliban, and we had to deal with that in the negotiation, was their self-image. They saw themselves as victims who had done an incredible sacrifice. Part of the political problem with Taliban is that they feel they deserve what they got because they have made incredible sacrifices, because Americans have been bombing them without any... They have lost an incredible number of men. So this feeling of... They feel like victims. This victimization is something that needs to be recognized in any process, in any negotiation process. Well, these are deep issues. Let's start to come to an end. There are two questions from in-present audience members and one question from the chat box, which will be the last one. Okay, go ahead. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Paula, and I have a question for each one of you. To you, Sergio, I want to ask you, you talk about the political project. I mean, you do not need to politicize a terrorist group, but to negotiate, it's important. In the case of Barrio 18 Semanas Salvatrucha in Salvador and Honduras, even if it's not a political project, when it's something that has such an effect on the population and it's on a daily basis and for many years, to refuse talking to them has been strategic, or has it been a mistake? And with regards to what you mentioned beforehand, i.e. that all Spanish presidents had had negotiations with ETA, but Aznar, for example, Pepe actually never justified ETA, and it blamed ETA of just about everything. But from a strategic point of view, if you're trying to negotiate peace with ETA, and you have this political discourse for the peace process, it's counterproductive, isn't it?
Espera. Sí. Pasa ahí al micro, sisplau.
I'm going to ask in English.
That every political president tried to mediate with ETA, and the Pepe government used to have a really hard speech on ETA, and I don't know if that was good for the peace process or not. Like, if you're trying to do that, I mean, I understand it as a political way, but if you're being so harsh in that, I don't know if it's good for the process or not.
Mi pregunta va un poco.
Question is about what you said about Mexican cartels. I'm an Italian journalist. In Italy, the Italian state between 1993 and the end of 1992 decided to open up communication channels with the mafia after the killing of Monfalcone and Forcetino. And in that case, don't you believe it's right what the Italian state did? What would have been a better framework to carry that out? Well, as usual, concepts may be filled up as you wish. Okay, first, what is political? What is a political group? Of course, if an organization, an armed organization, has some coercion capacity over a population in a territory, you know, Cosa Nostra in the 19th century, or the Mexican cartels nowadays, or parts of Colombia nowadays, well, then clearly this has a political component because they are interacting with that society, with those communities, with part of the polis, as we could say. But somebody could say, well, if you look at it objectively, here there is a political problem. Now, this could be true, but from that situation, the consequence does not stem that I, as a state, I decide to develop. We Colombians were so legal lovers. We have so many laws, and this is very Colombian. We need to have very firm limitations between one world and the next. Because if not, in the case of Colombia, what I'm doing is to create perverse incentives for these groups to deploy even more violence than they normally do, to become even more militarized, to get into a process of dialogue with me. And this is not an academic theory. This is what happened in Colombia with the paramilitary process. And a number of drug dealers got united with that goal. For a country like Colombia, it is very important conceptually and strategically to distinguish between both. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be accurate with the terms. That doesn't mean that from a legal point of view, I mean, Anglo-Saxon systems in the States, what happens? They are constantly offering criminals negotiation offers. And the prosecution of drug dealing works on the basis of agreements, and they go to a court where everything has already been agreed on beforehand and full stop. And this, if you take this to a more social level, like the Maras Salvatrucha, for example, I feel that a state may have contacts, a state may offer roads to channel people to the legality and that recognize in a realistic way the dimension of the problem. Then, in the case of Italy, well, Cesar Gaviria had a horrible negotiation with Pablo Escobar, but that's what he had at the time. And you can even somehow, without these being political negotiations or peace negotiations, to say that I'm going to take up the responsibility of these communities. But within this framework, to me, what's most important is to know that this is a justice system framework, the state of law. It is a vertical relationship. It is not a horizontal relationship in a peace that you have in a peace negotiation.
There was a written question to come as well.
No.
All right, it's already.
I can, but that's the final question then.
Okay, right. I mean, I basically agree with Sergio about the criminal aspects. There have been attempts in El Salvador to negotiate with the gangs in El Salvador, none of which have actually succeeded because they don't have political objectives, essentially. So you can't really have a political negotiation with someone that has no political objectives. It doesn't mean you can't negotiate with armed groups. I mean, hostage negotiation is a whole different discipline. Negotiating to get hostages released is a specific and rather different type of negotiation. I remember being approached by someone trying to negotiate between two gangs in Birmingham in the middle of England who were killing each other. They were using 12-year-olds to kill members on each side, and the 20-year-olds who'd come out of jail wanted to stop it, and we did manage to help them negotiate peace, but that's a different sort of peace. It's not a political peace. It's trying to it's a ceasefire more than anything else, trying to stop the killings. On the Aznar point, I mean, I don't know why the Aznar talks failed. I'm not sure that ETA was serious at the time. I think that his rhetoric didn't help much. He was very tentative about the way he went into the negotiations with ETA. There were a number of reasons, I guess. I mean, I certainly wasn't around at the time anyway, but just looking at the history of it, I'm not sure that it was his rhetoric entirely. But you raise a good point that it is quite hard to make peace if you're still denouncing the group as devils, because how do you expect people to accept that you're making peace with people that you're still denouncing? There is a phase you go through, and one of the interesting things we haven't talked about in Colombia was the approach that President Santos adopted of fighting and talking. Normally, well, in Northern Ireland anyway, we had a ceasefire before we would negotiate. We would not negotiate with the IRA while it was still conducting violence. President Santos went the other way because of Caguan and the experience of the ceasefire then, which had been disastrous, and insisted on keeping pressure on the FARC while talking to them, and that succeeded remarkably well. But he still had to wind the rhetoric down in order to get to a lasting peace. You can't make peace with people you're still denouncing, so there is certainly a way of doing that. One other question we didn't answer earlier, which was just about mediation, how is mediation mediation wasn't really used in Colombia. There were the Norwegians and Cubans, but they weren't mediating, they were witnesses. South Africa, they didn't accept mediators at the table. There were different sorts of mediation. My own impression in Afghanistan, neither side would accept mediators. Both were clear, well, particularly the Taliban were clear they didn't want any non-Afghans in the room. In the end, Jean Arnault managed to get into the room, but he didn't really manage to play the role of a mediator. So I think we need to think more imaginatively about how mediation is done. And I like the idea of virtual mediation, where you have advisors on both sides who can talk to each other and make some progress, and then allow progress to be made at the table. So I think we need to be more creative when we talk about mediation. It's not always just some man like George Mitchell, who played an important role in Northern Ireland. It can be done in a different sort of way.
Wrap up, terminamos con
Let's wrap up, and we will end with the last question, and in fact, the answer should be close, and that will be the end. Jason Arias from the Colombian Commission, he asks both Jonathan and Sergio, could you talk about one action or one decision that nowadays you believe you would not repeat or that you would change? And given that the fact that you're old colleagues, maybe, Sergio, you could start. Okay, I'm going to be a mediator. Okay, I'll ask the other party. Do you agree to answering first, Jonathan?
I mean, there are lots of things from negotiations, including the Northern Ireland negotiation, I regret. And if you could live your life backwards, you could do things much more effectively. But there's one thing I regret, but I'm not sure I would do it differently, which is maybe a sort of strange way of phrasing it. One of the central issues in Northern Ireland was weapons. And historically in Northern Ireland, what happened with weapons when you had a peace agreement going back to the 19th and 18th centuries was they just buried the weapons. The weapons were put, it was called the pike in the thatch. You'd put the weapons in the roof of the house. And so weapons were not a big issue when you negotiated a peace agreement. It became an issue for us because John Major, when he was negotiating a ceasefire with the IRA, he could not get the IRA to say they were going on a permanent ceasefire. And he was afraid that he'd be negotiating under the threat of violence, which he thought was the wrong way to negotiate. And they absolutely would not say permanent ceasefire, just a temporary ceasefire. So he tried to introduce a surrogate for a permanent ceasefire, and he demanded they give up all their weapons before they be allowed to come to the table to negotiate. And the trouble with setting that kind of precondition is you get into a real mess, because the IRA said, no, we're not going to do that. So Major was stuck. So then he said, you've got to give up the most of your weapons to come to the table. And the IRA said no, so he was stuck again. He came up with something famously called Washington 3, where he sent his Northern Ireland secretary to Washington, who proposed they give up a token amount of their weapons in order to come to the table. And again, they said no. He was completely stuck. And this issue then became a really big problem in the negotiation. And we couldn't solve it in the Good Friday Agreement. We solved many of the other problems, but weapons we could not solve. And we could have sat there for 3 years rather than 3 days and 3 nights, and we would not have solved it, because the Unionists would not go into government with people who still had a private army and had weapons, perfectly reasonable position. The Republicans did not believe that the Unionists would ever share power with them. If they gave their weapons up, they would lose their leverage and there'd be no power sharing. So we were stuck. So we used ambiguous language. We called it to ourselves creative ambiguity. But actually the trouble with creative ambiguity is it quite quickly becomes destructive ambiguity. And it led to the undermining of the belief in the agreement by the Unionists. The Unionists no longer believed that what we had written on paper was true, because they thought it would mean the IRA giving their weapons up. And when the IRA didn't give their weapons up, they wouldn't go into government. And we then spent the next 9 years trying to unravel that before we actually got the institutions up in a lasting way. So I regret having used creative ambiguity, but I'm not sure I've done anything different, because I don't think we would have got to the Good Friday Agreement if we hadn't had it.
Ahora sí, tú cierras.
It's your turn to close it. Okay. I'm not going to mention one mistake. I'm going to mention 2 mistakes. The first one is that Colombia still has different sources of violence. But in the sense of a guerrilla with a long history, it's the longest one and the most powerful one in Latin America, the FARC and LLN. And it was always a big challenge, how to coordinate both things. And at some point, given that the negotiation with FARC was so powerful and it was also so complex and it demanded so much attention, for whatever reasons, President Santos decided to create a commission that was a side group to try to deal with LLN. And that created, I mean, when you have a task, he wants to do it and you have to do it. But here you miss many coordination opportunities because that was the right time to deal with both. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, it was very difficult, but for having achieved some sort of an arrangement with LLN, which was almost reached. But when I was already out, there was a classical case in Colombia with regards to LLN. People are starting to know about it, but they do not know the details of it. What happened? It's similar with May '68 in America with Vietnam and Nixon. They had actually agreed on some rules of the game, and at the end, the government, the new government said, through somebody who had been from the previous government, an ambassador, who said no, they should not sign that because there was something better coming up. What the LLN denotes that was a trap. Nothing better came up. The second mistake that was very costly to us was that maybe due to the vision. I mean, in Colombia we have the armed conflict, but behind the armed conflict there is a factual situation. Colombia is a fragmented country. It is a country divided up regionally with a limited democracy in many large areas of the country in every sense of the term, except for the formal right to vote. And given that we created a whole vision to try through this process to promote an integration that brings a pacification of the country to solve the country. And I personally was so much into something that I call the territorial project, we lost sight of the communication with the large cities in Colombia. And we did some things. And we had forums in different capital cities in different regions of the country, but we didn't give them a clear explanation to most Colombians who live in a very humble way in large cities in Colombia, to tell them why they should be interested in that. Because one of the historical perspectives, and frankly and honestly, the political debate, President Santos has not been acknowledged enough with a historical act of identifying the right moment to negotiate. Because the consequence of being successful in security policy is the reason why you negotiate. And this is what happens in Israel. You're sitting down in a coffee shop or in a beach in Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv is the one that wants to negotiate. Why should I give any concessions if we all live so well here? So Anna Maria was telling me the other day that, okay, listen, they're saying that FARC is going to get so much for their integration, and what will I get? To her, all of this is very distant. Whereas Ms. Elena, this extraordinary member of the Truth Commission, a friend of ours, Richard Moreno, who made an incredible speech in front of the Congress when he was discussing what to do with the new agreement. And he said, okay, we'll live with a problem in the back of our necks, but they did not see that. They would see it on TV. We should have been much more educational. We should have made a greater communication effort. Because for the main mass of Colombians who are city dwellers, who live in cities, there's been a long discussion, almost 2 hours, but everyone is very much attentive. We had 2 wonderful guest speakers, Jonathan and Sergio, who fascinate us with their personal experience and the depth and the transcendence of their thoughts. Thank you, Sergio, for being here with us. Thank you so much for coming, Jonathan, for coming, and to all of you, thank you for your presence and attention. Thank you.